Never liked the Beatles. I never really liked any British group. I don't think the British should play rock and roll.
The Beatles, a cultural titan that reshaped modern music, ascending from Beatlemania to Jeet Peppers, is the gold standard of pop culture greatness, influencing generations and shaping genres. Yet, for all their seismic influence, not everyone stood in adoration. Some of music's most formidable names have overtly branded them overrated, outdated, or worse. From raw, unfiltered insults to subtle intellectual dismissals, these critiques emerge from legends who dared to challenge the Fab Four's hallowed status. In this deep dive, we explore 5 iconic musicians who, with bold conviction and sometimes brutal candor, articulated precisely why they just couldn't stand the Beatles. Prepare for a paradigm shift. 1. Lou Reed. The Beatles? I thought they were garbage. This blunt assessment, delivered in a 1987 interview, wasn't mere casual dislike. It was a profound rejection of pop music's sacred idols from a towering figure in experimental rock. Reed, architect of the Velvet Underground, perceived the Beatles not as innovators, but as emblematic of mainstream cultural delusion. During that same televised PBS interview, Reed doubled down. No, I never liked the Beatles. I thought they were rubbish. More than just an edgy soundbite, Reed underscored his conviction with a biting hierarchy of musical worth, claiming, "The other stuff couldn't come up to our ankles, the level we were on compared to everyone else." Reed's animosity was rooted deeply in his artistic philosophy, championing the raw, the uncomfortable, the underbelly of culture through themes of addiction, sadomasochism, and urban decay, a stark contrast to the Beatles' polished British pop charm, even in their more experimental phases. This mass acceptance of Reed was problematic. A profound sense of personal and professional bitterness further fueled Reed's stance. While the Velvet Underground garnered critical praise in underground circles, they faced commercial failure and a lot of bad press, a baffling contrast to the Beatles' global adoration and messianic status. Reed's resentment culminated in his disdain for what he termed the Beatles' painfully stupid and pretentious attempts at arty music, lumping them with bands like The Doors, defining experimentation without intellectual rigor as mere polished fraudulence. Interestingly, earlier comments from the 1970s, like, "They just make the songs up, bing, 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 they have to be the most incredible songwriters ever," suggest a tone of sarcasm rather than genuine praise, particularly the dismissive bing, bing, bing. What truly inflamed Reed's distaste was the mythologizing of the Beatles, their sanitized narrative from mop-tops to gurus, which he rejected in favor of music that was real, difficult, and confrontational. By the 1980s, Reed viewed the Beatles' enduring legacy as a force that fostered replication over revolution, pushing him further into dissonance, minimalism, and lyrical extremism, as if to deliberately distance himself from the very notion of beat. 2. Quincy Jones. They were the worst musicians in the world, no playing motherfuckers. With this single, incendiary quote in a 2018 New York Magazine interview, the legendary producer Quincy Jones ignited a firestorm, his scathing takedown of the Beatles, particularly Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, reverberating across the industry. Jones, a titan with an unparalleled legacy collaborating with Michael Jackson, Frank Sinatra, and countless jazz legends, didn't just criticize their music, he dismantled their very credibility. "Paul was the worst bass player I ever heard," he declared, "and Ringo, don't even talk about it." From a 28-time Grammy winner, these weren't playful jabs but artillery strikes. Jones's anecdote about Ringo Starr became infamously precise. In the 1970 Sentimental Journey sessions, Ringo purportedly struggled for hours with a simple 4-bar phrase. Jones recounted how he and producer George Martin subtly ushered Ringo out for a break, only to secretly bring in jazz drummer Ronnie Verrell, who finished the part in a mere 15 minutes. Upon Ringo's return, hearing the playback and remarking, "That didn't sound so bad," Jones delivered the brutal punchline, "Yeah, motherfucker, because it ain't you." This venom from a producer steeped in the technical precision of jazz and soul stemmed from a worldview valuing complex arrangements and harmonic sophistication, elements he found lacking in early Beatles records. He famously disparaged rock as just a white version of rhythm and blues, implying the Beatles were appropriators lacking both skill and proper credit. Jones, known for his unfiltered opinions, also criticized Michael Jackson and U2, and even claimed to know who killed JFK, prompting many to attribute his outbursts to age, frustration, or calculated provocation before his Netflix documentary. Paul McCartney, ever the diplomat, responded with bewilderment and affection. In a 2018 GQ interview, McCartney revealed Jones later apologized, claiming to have been misquoted. "Paul, I didn't really say that thing. You know I love you guys." McCartney, with a glass of wine in hand, met the madness with humor, telling Jones, "If you had said that, you know what I would have said. Fuck you, Quincy Jones." They laughed, seemingly diffusing the storm, though McCartney's underlying skepticism remained. "He's an old guy, I don't know what it was, but I don't think I'm the worst bass player he's ever heard." The debate transcended personal insults, evolving into a clash of musical cultures and generational values regarding what truly defines greatness. Jones represented a world of technical mastery. The early Beatles, self-taught and instinctive, stumbled into brilliance through experimentation. While their mid to late 60s work, particularly Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road, demonstrated exponential growth in complexity, Jones's initial impressions, reinforced by the 1970 Ringo encounter, evidently stuck. Yet Jones never fully dismissed them as people, reaffirming affection for McCartney and calling Ringo a great guy. In the end, Quincy Jones's remarks, though stinging, powerfully underscored that greatness is fundamentally a matter of perspective, sparking necessary conversations about art. 3. Trent Reznor. McCartney, ever cool, probably said it best. "Quincy Jones, you fucking crazy motherfucker." But from Trent Reznor came a different kind of blunt force. "They're dead. They're ugly now. Fuck the Beatles. I hated people who were always going on about the fucking Beatles." This infamous 1994 Plasma magazine quote crystallized the Nine Inch Nails frontman's profound disdain for the Beatles early in his career. At his rebellious peak, Reznor's rejection wasn't merely musical criticism. It was an ideological stance against nostalgia, against musical orthodoxy, and against the perceived complacency of popular taste. For Reznor, the Beatles were a sacred cow, revered by a generation whose tastes he found stifling, and their persistent cultural footprint became a focal point of his fury. This generational disconnect deeply shaped Reznor's views. Growing up in the late 1970s and 80s, he felt alienated by a stale, sentimental musical establishment where the Beatles were omnipresent. As he told Rolling Stone in 2011, "When I was growing up, the people who liked the Beatles I didn't like, so I didn't pay attention to them." Reznor's early music, steeped in addiction, nihilism, and self-destruction, was a direct rejection of musical comfort. The Downward Spiral, a brutal, unsettling concept album designed to confront the polished legacy of classic rock. The critically acclaimed, culturally dominant Beatles were a natural target, yet by the mid-2000s, Reznor's perspective began a profound shift. In that same Rolling Stone interview, he confessed to discovering what he had missed. "Around the Downward Spiral, I really started digging White Album-era Beatles, and it expanded outward from there. They were so far ahead of the game. It's just not." 4. Michael Stipe. There. This was more than a reluctant acknowledgement from Trent Reznor. It was an admission of a complete misjudgment. As Reznor matured, he recognized the Beatles' innovations in songwriting, studio experimentation, and artistic risk-taking. From another iconic frontman, R.E.M's Michael Stipe, came a disarming comparison. "The Beatles were elevator music. The Beatles were elevator music in my lifetime. Yummy, yummy, yummy. I've got love in my tummy. Had more impact on me." This 1992 Rolling Stone quote wasn't meant to provoke. It was an honest reflection of how the Beatles registered in his personal and cultural development. Stipe, never one for bitterness, held a detached indifference, even resistance to the band. Born in 1960, He entirely missed Beatlemania. By the 1970s, when his musical consciousness formed, the band had already disbanded, their experimental heyday fading into nostalgia. "I'm not really a Beatles fan, though," he admitted to Pitchfork. "I acknowledge their genius, but I'm just not the generation that grew up with them. It's not something I'm personally drawn to, and that's gotten me into a lot of trouble in the past." Stipe's earliest Beatles memory underscores this detachment, hearing the German-language version of I Want to Hold Your Hand from a high radio shelf in a German babysitter's home, where the surreal setting imprinted more than the music itself. For Stipe, the Beatles weren't life-altering, they were simply background. During his formative teenage years, it wasn't the Beatles' psychedelia that defined his taste, but the punk and post-punk movements, drawing inspiration from artists like Patti Smith, Television, Talking Heads, and the Velvet Underground, artists working around or outside the Beatles' influence. What makes Stipe's stance notable is its rarity among artists of his caliber. Most musicians pay at least cursory homage to the Beatles as an unavoidable reference point. Stipe refused this gravitational pull, with even R.E.M's jangly guitars owing more to the Byrds than to Rubber Soul or Abbey Road. His cautious tone when discussing them reflects an awareness of the cultural cost of dismissal, revealing a quiet critique of the cultural machinery that elevates certain artists to untouchable status, crowding out alternative narratives. 5. Julian Casablancas. Not liking the Beatles helped me stand out. This statement from Julian Casablancas, frontman of The Strokes and The Voids, in a 2018 Rolling Stone interview, revealed his detachment from the Fab Four as a deliberate act, a creative edge in a world where Beatles worship was the norm. Unlike his peers, Casablancas didn't idolize the Beatles, seeing them as a dominant branch of pop culture that had saturated the musical ecosystem. "I feel like that's almost like the branch of like 98% of stuff you hear," he explained, referencing how most modern artists channel Beatles-esque harmonies or song structures. His aversion stemmed from this saturation. The Beatles' shadow loomed over music education, journalism, and even label scouting, and he found it exhausting to see every generation compared to, or expected to tip their hat to, their legacy. Casablancas preferred to look elsewhere for inspiration, notably the Velvet Underground, noting, "I know Lou Reed hated the Beatles." Indeed, Reed's infamous garbage remark resonated with Casablancas' broader critique of what he calls cultural brainwashing, the process by which mainstream media, streaming algorithms, and chart metrics condition public taste towards safe, market-tested. He lamented to Variety that today someone like Ariel Pink is relatively unknown. In another era he would have been much more popular. People think that public opinion in their own time is the truth. Casablancas' views extend to the internet's failure to democratize music. He once hoped platforms like YouTube and Spotify would expose diverse global music, but instead found they only further entrenched the dominance of formulaic pop, turning artists like the Beatles, once counterculture, into part of a predictable rotation that crowds out diversity. He draws a sharp line between innovation and popularity, distrusting commercial success as a measure of artistic value, striving for a world where Ariel Pink is as popular as Ed Sheeran, or the Velvet Underground more revered than the Rolling Stone. Julian Casablancas' detachment isn't emotional fury, but an intellectual and cultural refusal to participate in the near-universal glorification surrounding the band, challenging the very myth of musical immortality. The Beatles were not merely a band, they were a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally rewrote the rules of popular music. While critiques of their musicianship, such as Quincy Jones's infamous "no playing motherfuckers" remark, have occasionally emerged, these do little to diminish their monumental legacy. Instead, such comments only underscore the extraordinary cultural weight the Beatles continue to carry, decades after their final studio album. The Beatles arrived at a pivotal moment in post-war history, as Western youth in the early 1960s were ready to forge a distinct identity, and their emergence in 1963 with the explosion of Beatlemania perfectly captured this generational shift, transforming them from mere entertainers into spokespeople for an age. Their early singles, Please Please Me, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, though deceptively simple, set new standards for songwriting and charisma. By 1964, their influence became transatlantic. The Beatles' arrival in the United States and appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show not only launched the British invasion, but shifted the global center of pop music, offering America a fresh blend of harmony, personality, and charm that challenged the dominance of Elvis Presley and the Motown sound. And they were not content to remain teen idols. They continually evolved, pulling the entire music industry forward. Throughout the mid to late 1960s, the Beatles transitioned from crowd-pleasing entertainers to avant-garde artists, with albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver introducing lyrical complexity, studio experimentation, and genre fusion that redefined pop music, culminating in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, frequently cited as one of rock history's most important albums for transforming the album into an art form rather than a mere collection of singles, thus elevating rock music from commercial entertainment into a legitimate artistic medium worthy of critical and academic attention. Moreover, the Beatles were instrumental in shifting industry dynamics, decentering American rock's monopoly by opening global markets to British acts and enabling other UK artists like the Rolling Stones, The Who, and Pink Floyd to break through internationally, while simultaneously dismantling the idea that artists must rely heavily on outside songwriters or producers, with Lennon and McCartney's self-written catalog and the band's increasing control over their production processes inspiring generations to take ownership of their work, both musically and commercially. Their influence wasn't limited to music alone. The Beatles reflected and accelerated broader cultural shifts, their visibility in fashion, spirituality, and politics, helping establish musicians as multidimensional public figures, popularizing everything from collarless suits and mop-top haircuts to psychedelic prints and Eastern meditation, with their public experimentation with LSD and subsequent embrace of transcendental meditation, aligning them with the burgeoning counterculture, and Lennon's provocative 1966 declaration that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, stirred outrage but also revealed how the band had become a cultural mirror, reflecting, provoking, and amplifying societal tensions. Commercially, their achievements remain staggering. An estimated 600 million records sold worldwide, with songs like Yesterday and Hey Jude among the most covered in modern history, and in the US alone, they boasted 20 #1 Billboard singles and 19 #1 albums, topping the US alone singles charts on average every 6 weeks from 1964 to 1970, even holding the entire top 5 of the Billboard Hot 100 on April 4, 1964, an unmatched achievement culminating in their 1965 appointment as members of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II, marking the first time pop musicians were publicly honored by the establishment, and in 2004, Rolling Stone named Sgt. Pepper the greatest album of all time. Their breakup in 1970 did not diminish their impact. Instead, it marked the beginning of a mythologizing process, with each former Beatle pursuing solo careers that added to their legacies, from John Lennon's activism and Imagine to McCartney's Wings and later solo successes, Harrison's All Things Must Pass, and Starr's enduring popularity, while the 1970s also saw the emergence of the Beatles as a subject of serious academic and journalistic study, transforming them from pop stars into historical figures. What truly sustains the Beatles' legacy today is not just nostalgia but relevance. Their music continues to be reissued, remastered, and streamed by new generations, and The Beatles Get Back, Peter Jackson's 2021 documentary, offered a revelatory look at their final creative moments, introducing them to millions of younger viewers. In classrooms and film scores, on TikTok and in stadiums, the Beatles remain ever-present, not frozen in time, but continually reframed for each cultural moment, their musical fingerprints embedded in genres far beyond rock, with elements of their songwriting, harmonies, and experimentation appearing in hip-hop sampling, indie rock aesthetics, electronic textures, and orchestral pop, inspiring everyone from Prince to Nirvana, Radiohead to Taylor Swift, when Beyoncé